I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in someplace unusual.
There is a moment in The Sound of Music that every fan remembers by heart. A gazebo, soft light, two people finally admitting what they felt for weeks. It is supposed to be the most tender scene in the entire film. And for decades, that's exactly how audiences saw it. Flawless, dreamy, effortless. Except it wasn't effortless at all. It was one of the most chaotic shoots in the whole production, a scene that had to be rescued by accident, in the dark, because nobody involved could keep a straight face. And that's just the beginning. Behind almost every perfect frame of this beloved musical was a story the studio didn't want told. A near drowning, a director who was drunk on camera, a leading man who despised the film he was making, and a helicopter that knocked the star flat into the mud again and again. This is the story 20th Century Fox buried for years, told through the people who actually lived it. Long before Julie Andrews ever set foot in Salzburg, the story of the Von Trapp family had already conquered Europe. In the 1950s, German film producers adapted Maria von Trapp's memoir into two low-budget features that became massive hits across West Germany and beyond. Audiences recovering from the devastation of the war connected with a real family who had chosen music and courage over fear. When American studio executives eventually saw those German films, they weren't impressed. The style felt dated, overly sentimental, almost amateurish, by Hollywood standards. Nobody wanted to touch it, until a Broadway-minded producer looked past the clumsy production values and saw the bones of something extraordinary. That instinct eventually led to a stage musical built specifically for Mary Martin, one of Broadway's biggest stars at the time, with songs written entirely from scratch by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein too. The show became a sensation, running for years at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater and setting the stage, quite literally, for the film that would eventually take over the world. But translating that stage success to the screen would prove far messier than anyone expected. The film version needed a cast, a location, and a director. All three would come with complications nobody could have predicted. It's also worth remembering that Maria von Trapp herself made an unusual choice years before any of this took shape. She wasn't a savvy Hollywood negotiator. She was a woman trying to keep her family afloat, and when European filmmakers first came asking for the rights to her story, she agreed to a modest one-time payment rather than any ongoing share of future profits. It seemed reasonable at the time. Nobody involved could have guessed the story would eventually turn into a stage sensation, and then one of the highest-grossing films ever made. What Maria did insist on, though, was accuracy. She wanted her family's story told honestly, in full, rather than loosely inspired by her book the way some studios initially proposed. That insistence on truth is a little ironic, considering how much of the truth about the film's own production would stay hidden for decades afterward. There's another layer of irony buried in the finished film itself, one worth returning to later in this story. Because even the most true moments in this movie turn out to have been reshaped for the screen long before any of the on-set chaos ever began. Of all the sequences filmed for The Sound of Music, none gave the crew more trouble than the scene inside the garden gazebo, where Maria and Captain Von Trapp finally confess their feelings for each other during the song Something Good. On paper, it should have been simple. Two actors, standing close, singing softly under gentle lighting. In practice, it became one long, uncontrollable fit of laughter. The culprit was the equipment. To simulate soft moonlight glowing through the gazebo's glass panes, the crew used enormous carbon arc lights, powerful, industrial fixtures that hummed and buzzed as their internal carbon rods burned down. And every so often, without warning, those lights let out a loud, unmistakably rude noise. Julie Andrews later described it plainly. Every time she and Christopher Plummer got close enough to say the words, "I love you," the lights above them would let out an awful raspberry, as if commenting on the scene itself. The two actors would dissolve into giggles, compose themselves, try again, and the lights would groan right on cue, ruining another take. By some accounts, dozens of takes were lost to laughter alone. The crew tried everything to stop it, repositioning lights, replacing equipment, waiting out the noise, but nothing worked. Eventually, the production, simply gave up trying to light the scene properly. Cinematographer Ted McCord made the call to shoot the entire sequence in near silhouette, hiding the actors' faces in shadow so their laughter wouldn't be visible on camera. What was meant to be a technical failure ended up becoming one of the most romantic visual choices in the film, a warm, glowing outline of two people falling in love, born entirely out of desperation to stop the giggling. For years, audiences assumed that dreamy lighting was an artistic decision from the start. It wasn't. It was damage control. The truth didn't fully surface until Julie Andrews told the story herself, decades later, in a television interview, laughing as she recalled how impossible it was to perform an intimate love scene with what sounded like a chorus of raspberries interrupting every line. What makes the story even funnier in hindsight is that Plummer had his own theory about why the laughter kept creeping back in, separate from the lights entirely. He found something inherently silly about the whole setup. Two adults standing nose to nose, murmuring a love song at each other from an inch away. To him, it simply wasn't how real people behaved, and every time he tried to play it straight, the absurdity of the staging would catch up with him all over again. Combine that with a temperamental light fixture literally heckling the scene, and it's honestly a miracle the crew ever got a usable take at all. Adding to the difficulty, the gazebo set was also a nightmare from a purely technical standpoint, long before the raspberry noises ever became an issue. Its glass walls reflected light unpredictably depending on the angle of the sun, forcing the cinematographer to get creative just to avoid glare, at one point having crew members lie flat on the studio floor so their own reflections wouldn't show up in the glass panels behind the actors. By the time the noisy arc lights entered the picture, the crew was already fighting an uphill battle just to make the small wooden structure look believable on camera. If the gazebo scene was a battle with equipment, Christopher Plummer's entire experience on the film was a battle with himself. Long before cameras rolled, Plummer had already decided the material wasn't for him. He found the script overly sweet, even saccharine, and privately, then later publicly, nicknamed the film The Sound of Mucus. He felt the story was drenched in sentimentality, far removed from the serious, classically trained work he wanted to be known for. He took the role anyway, and reportedly negotiated changes to give his character more depth, more edge, something to balance out all that wholesomeness. But once filming began in Salzburg, his frustration didn't disappear. He described the picturesque Austrian city as suffocating rather than charming, and by his own later admission, he leaned heavily on food and alcohol to get through the shoot, enough that his costumes reportedly had to be let out during production. That tension didn't stay behind the scenes forever. Plummer was open in later interviews and in his memoir about how difficult he found the experience, poking fun at his own younger self as arrogant and disconnected from a story he didn't respect at the time. It's a strange thing to reconcile. An actor who resented nearly every day of filming ended up delivering one of the most beloved performances in movie musical history. His frustration occasionally spilled out in smaller, sharper moments too. By his own account, he once arrived on location in a full temper after not receiving his call sheet for the day, stormed across Salzburg trying to track down the crew, and marched straight into the middle of an active take with Julie Andrews and the children, letting loose a burst of complaints at the director and everyone standing nearby, before realizing he'd just interrupted filming entirely. It's a small, human moment that never made it into any trailer or press release. An internationally respected stage actor, thrown off by nothing more than a missing piece of paper, blowing up in the middle of a children's musical number. None of this means Plummer phoned in his performance. Quite the opposite. Cast members who worked closely with him often described someone who, despite his private grumbling, treated the material and his fellow actors with real professionalism on camera. Off camera, though, he found other ways to cope. He was a genuinely gifted pianist, having trained toward a career as a concert musician before turning to acting, and he'd often play late into the evening to keep the cast entertained during the long, rain-soaked nights in Salzburg. It's one of the more charming contradictions of the shoot. A man who couldn't stand the sentimentality of the project he was filming, quietly providing some of its warmest, most genuine moments after the cameras stopped rolling. Here's the detail that still surprises people who grew up loving this movie. One of its most emotional moments was filmed under less than sober conditions. During the sequence where Captain Von Trapp sings Edelweiss at the music festival, a moment audiences remember as achingly sincere, a broken man reconnecting with his humanity. Plummer later admitted he had been drinking heavily that day. He didn't shy away from the admission in later years, treating it almost as a punchline about how strange filmmaking can be. A performance that reduced audiences to tears, delivered by an actor who could barely stand up straight. It's a strange kind of magic particular to film sets, sincerity captured almost by accident in the middle of circumstances that had nothing to do with genuine emotional preparation. Whatever the reason behind it, the scene worked. It became one of the emotional high points of the entire film, and most viewers had no idea about the condition its star was actually in. As if the drinking wasn't enough of a blow to his pride, Plummer faced another indignity that stung far more personally. Much of his singing in the film isn't actually him. Producers felt his voice, while pleasant, didn't have the polish or vocal control the songs demanded. So they brought in professional playback singer Bill Lee, a veteran vocalist who had also lent his voice to several Disney productions, to record the bulk of the more demanding vocal passages, including large portions of Edelweiss and Something Good. Plummer's own voice was used for the shorter, simpler transitions, but the sustained, technically difficult singing belonged to someone else entirely. Plummer reportedly wasn't thrilled about the decision, feeling it undercut a performance he'd already worked hard to shape. For decades, most audiences had no idea the voice they associated so closely with Captain Von Trapp belonged to another singer. It wasn't until years later, including the release of Plummer's own original, undubbed vocal recordings on an anniversary soundtrack, that fans could finally hear what his real singing voice on set had actually sounded like. Bill Lee, the man behind that uncredited performance, was something of a legend in his own quiet corner of the industry. He'd already spent years lending his voice to major animated productions, singing parts that audiences had unknowingly memorized for years without ever learning his name. Discovering that the same hidden voice behind so many beloved Disney songs was also secretly the voice of Captain Von Trapp added an unexpected layer to the mystery. A reminder that some of the most iconic vocal performances in mid-century Hollywood musicals belong to singers the public never got to see, let alone credit. When Plummer's original vocal takes finally surface decades later on a remastered soundtrack release, longtime fans got to hear just how different, and in its own way, just as compelling, his natural, less polished voice actually sounded. It wasn't the pristine, technically flawless instrument the studio had wanted, but it carried something the dubbed version never quite captured. The genuine, slightly imperfect sound of an actor pouring real emotion into a song, rather than a studio professional hitting every note with practiced precision. Not every hidden story from this production is a light-hearted one. During the filming of the boat scene, in which the Von Trapp children tumble into the lake after their sailboat capsizes, young Kim Carruth, cast as the youngest daughter, Gretel, genuinely could not swim. The plan going into the shot called for Julie Andrews to fall toward the child the moment the boat tipped, catching her immediately in the water. It didn't go according to plan. When the boat flipped, Andrews fell backward, away from where Gretel had gone under, rather than toward her. The young actress slipped beneath the surface more than once before another crew member dove in and pulled her out. She came up coughing and vomiting after swallowing lake water, and by her own later account, developed a lasting unease around swimming because of the experience. Andrews herself has described the moment as one of the more frightening incidents of the entire shoot, a stark reminder that even the most whimsical-looking scenes in this film carried real risk for the people performing them. Years later, in interviews reflecting back on the moment, both women were candid about how frightening it actually was in the water. Carruth recalled going under, swallowing lake water, and then being sick all over one of her fellow child actors' moments after being pulled out. Andrews, for her part, remembered swimming desperately toward where she thought the little girl would surface, only to realize she'd ended up on the wrong side of the capsized boat entirely. What reads on screen as a few playful seconds of splashing was, in reality, several genuinely tense moments for everyone involved. The kind of near miss that could have turned an otherwise cheerful family film into a tragedy. It's worth pointing out just how differently film sets handled safety in that era. There were no rehearsed rescue divers stationed just out of frame. No extensive safety briefings documented for every child performer entering open water. A 5-year-old who couldn't swim was placed in a boat designed to tip over, with a single adult actor as the only safeguard. When that safeguard didn't go according to plan, there was very little backup in place. It's a detail that stands in sharp contrast to the polished, cheerful tone of the finished scene. The film's opening shot has become one of the most iconic images in movie history. Julie Andrews spinning through an alpine meadow as the camera swoops overhead in a single sweeping motion. It looks effortless. It looks like pure joy caught on film. What audiences never saw was the helicopter itself, hovering just a short distance above her to capture that aerial movement. Each time it circled close enough to get the shot, the powerful downdraft from the rotors would knock Andrews flat into the grass. This happened again and again throughout filming. She'd get up, brush herself off, reset her expression, and start over, only to be flattened by the wind blast on the very next pass. She later joked good-naturedly about the experience, comparing it to being physically tackled by a machine, take after take, all in the name of one perfect shot that now opens one of the most celebrated films ever made. By her own account, the timing had to be precise down to the second. A crew member hidden in the nearby bushes with a megaphone, waiting for the helicopter to reach exactly the right position before shouting the cue for Andrews to begin her spin. Get it wrong, and the whole take was wasted. Get it right, and there was still the small matter of surviving the wind. Andrews later admitted that after the first couple of times being knocked down, she started to brace herself defensively before each pass, determined not to fall again. And every single time, the downdraft won anyway. It's a strange thing to picture. One of the most joyful, freeing images in movie history was, behind the camera, an exhausting exercise in repeatedly getting back up. The gazebo wasn't only the site of romantic mishaps. It nearly caused a serious injury during one of the final sequences filmed for the movie. During the number 16 going on 17, in which the eldest daughter, Liesl, dances gracefully across the gazebo's wooden benches, the set's glass panels had no protective backing or safety treatment. On one of the earliest takes, actress Charmian Carr leapt as choreographed and lost her footing, crashing straight through one of the glass panes and onto the studio floor below. She escaped with a sprained ankle rather than anything worse. But the injury was serious enough that a bandage had to be hidden under makeup for the remainder of the shoot. If you know exactly where to look in the finished film, that bandage is still faintly visible in a few frames, a small, permanent trace of an accident nobody was supposed to notice. There's one more quiet injustice buried in this story, and it has nothing to do with lights, weather, or near accidents. It has to do with money. Both Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer signed flat-fee contracts for the film, meaning they were paid a single, fixed sum for their work with no share of future box office earnings. No bonuses tied to ticket sales, no back-end profit participation of any kind. Once that check cleared, their financial relationship to the film was effectively over. That arrangement looks especially stark next to Mary Martin, who had originated the role of Maria on Broadway years earlier and negotiated a very different kind of deal, one that entitled her to a meaningful share of the stage production's enormous profits. When the film went on to become one of the highest-grossing movies ever made, neither of its two leads saw any additional compensation beyond what they'd agreed to before filming even began. Andrews had just come off a career-defining turn in another major film and was still viewed by studio executives as a promising newcomer rather than an established star worth a profit-sharing deal. Plummer, despite his considerable stage pedigree, was in a similar position, walking into a film role without the leverage to negotiate anything beyond his upfront salary. It's the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the glow of a film's legacy. Audiences remember the songs, the scenery, the Oscar wins. They don't tend to think about the fact that the two actors most responsible for making this story feel alive on screen never financially benefited from just how enormous that success turned out to be.